probably the better part of the last 4 years. Part of the work that I've been doing here at Watershed and really enjoyed doing has been helping people process sort of their past and their present religious experiences. And it's interesting, when I first started doing this work several years ago, I noticed there was like this 80-20 split in terms of the feedback I would receive around some of what Peter Enns just mentioned, the idea of being Christian. And what I mean by that is that there were like 80% of the feedback I would receive would be really endearing feedback. You know, Christianity through the perspective of it being loving and gracious and salvation and forgiveness of sins and unconditional love. That sort of idea in terms of how it was endearing for some people. And then the 20% was less than endearing and even critical at times. The way that people would describe their experience with Christianity or Christians. They would say things like hypocritical or legalistic, judgmental, homophobic, myopic, out of touch with reality. And so that was maybe 3-4 years ago. And what I've noticed over the last couple of years is how those percentages have sort of traded places. There's an inversion that's taken place, so that now when I sit with people, it's like 80% of the feedback is sort of critical. It's less than endearing, and 20% is endearing. So there's been a shift in the landscape, maybe not just here at Watershed, but in general, in the way that the world is actually engaging this idea of being Christian. And I know for some of you, and I would fall into this category, I'm endeared to it. For the better part of 50 years, it's been a part of my journey, my tradition, the way I've understood myself and my life with God, intimacy with Christ, and everything in between. But then I know for some of you, it's been hard. For some of you, you're exhausted with trying to explain the sort of Christian that you are not, right? Like you show up someplace and someone asks you about something and you're having to sort of jump through all these hoops just to convince someone that you're not the stereotypical version of what they envision a Christian to be. And to the extent that some people even ask, what does it even mean to be Christian anymore? Or my friend Don, several months ago, who, when I was with a group of people, said, are we even Christian anymore? For the past several weekends, we've been kind of hosting a series of conversations surrounding what it looks like when you move away from a more organized way of seeing your religious self, a more organized way of seeing Christianity, really, if you want to be really transparent about it, and the sort of shifts that take place when you migrate away and you start embracing a more open, a more inclusive, a more progressive way of understanding life, faith, theology, spirituality. And what I want to do this morning is I want to take just some time to talk about when you have an experience of migration, what that does to an understanding of what it means to be Christian. And so let me start here with just kind of saying a couple of things. In my experience with organized religion, organized Christianity really, as best as I can remember, more often than not, has been just a real strong focus on beliefs pertaining to Jesus. And what I mean by that specifically is Jesus as God. Jesus as the God that saves me from my sin, that saves us from hell. Jesus as this divine authority on ultimate truth and morality and justice and judgment. I think you could also include with that idea certain things that are believed to be true about the Bible, and we actually spent some time talking about that earlier on in our series. But what might be worth mentioning is that the term Christian actually, when it first surfaced, it wasn't even a religious term. It had nothing to do with religion when it first sort of came on the scene. The earliest Christians who lived with enormous amounts of persecution, suffering, and death, who were under immense Roman occupation and oppression, they had this reckless willingness to die and to suffer for and with each other. They had this scandalous way of loving and including people, not just within their community, but really the dregs of society, the person or the groups of people that were seen as completely lacking of any sort of worthiness to be included by the general status quo of the Roman sort of culture in which they lived. And so what happened was that as people outside of these communities outside of this movement started to observe the way these people were living. It was jaw-dropping. No one lived this way. And they knew that these sort of Jewish communities had started to follow this Rabbi Jesus, this person who had died and who had been rumored to be resurrected. And so they started to call them little Jesuses, which eventually morphed into Christ-like and eventually became something known as Christian. And this continued to be the descriptor for this group of people for roughly 200 to 300 years. It wasn't until the beliefs about Jesus became like canonized and turned into doctrine, and until Constantine, who was Rome's emperor in the 3rd century, declared Christianity, ironically enough, declared Christianity to be the official religion of the state, that it stopped being less about a way of living in that world as in terms of the way that group lived, and it became more of a religious disposition. And so here's the first thing. Yeah, I know it's just jaw-dropping, isn't it? No way! In disorganized religion, or maybe a better way to say it, in disorganized Christianity, the shift has. I think one of the shifts that starts to happen is instead of Jesus being divine, you don't kick that out of the car, so to speak, but there's a focus on Jesus as a way of being human. And so again, when I was growing up, the central focus was on Jesus as sort of this divine embodied super being, the Jesus that walked on water, that performed miracles, that turned water into wine, that healed the sick, the blind, the lame, that raised the dead, that cast out demons. And what I realized is that when I needed someone to save me from my sin, when I needed someone to sacrifice and die to appease God's wrath and save me from hell, the divine super being Jesus, who could perform miracles and prove that he was God, was really, really important. Like, I needed that focus to be intact. But when Jesus' death on the cross started to shift away from God's violent solution for my sin to God's willingness to enter into the suffering of humanity, when Jesus' death became a picture for what it looks like for God to meet and accept me or us at our worst moments and then invite us into some sort of redemptive or resurrected way of seeing life, a restored sense of ourself or transformation, the humanity of Jesus became really, really important. And not only this, but if one of the goals as a Christian, and this is what I was always told, was to be Christ-like, right? Like, what would Jesus do? Like, well, apparently Jesus would turn water into wine, and why I really like that idea, I just don't know if that's ever going to be my reality. I mean, I'm not convinced that I'm ever going to walk on water, even though Scott Hofer already thinks I do. You know, I'm probably not going to be able to do that. I don't see myself healing the sick or raising the dead and teleporting from one place to the next. And that's not to discredit someone else's experience here. Like, I fully acknowledge that throughout the history of Christianity, like miraculous, unexplainable events have been, like, stories are told about those sorts of things. And in my own life, like, there's these things that I don't have an explanation for. I don't know why the dots connect in some instances or why certain things transpire the way they do. And then if you really start to talk to people in our community, like, there's jaw-dropping things that have happened for some of you, and that's not to discredit any of that, right? That's not what I'm trying to say here. I'm really comfortable actually with the mystery of it all. But what started to happen for me was that as I started to really identify with the human Jesus, the flesh and blood Jesus, I started resonating with a Jesus that would become emotive, that would weep over suffering, that would weep over the loss of a brother. The Jesus that experienced stress and fear and doubt. The Jesus who sometimes wasn't sure about something, who would get asked point blank questions and his response would be, I don't know. I literally don't know. Or the Jesus who would become really passionate and sometimes find it necessary to express his anger. The Jesus whose teachings and wisdom were certainly eons ahead of their time in his day and age, but appear, at least from my perspective, to still be eons ahead of our time in this day and age. And by the way, I would surmise that early Christians found the humanity of Jesus deeply compelling, not just his divinity as compelling, like both. They held both of those in their hand. They wrote things like, in the beginning was the Word. John 1:1. This word, the word word in Greek is actually this word logos, and it was this expression of ultimate reality or divine ordering, divine reason. And it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word became flesh and blood, and it moved into the neighborhood. In other words, whatever or whoever these first Christians understood God to be, they believed that in Jesus, God became one of us. God lived and breathed where we live and breathe. He faced the same limitations, the same capacities for vulnerability and woundedness, no different than we do, which was a scandalous notion at the time. In the ancient world, gods never got their hands dirty. There was always a distancing, no matter what deity you were talking about. And they never got down in the dirt, in the mud and the clay and the messiness of what it meant to be human. And it's also why I think Jesus' humanity may have been really important for those who encountered him in the first century. I mean, when you're living in the midst of such dehumanization, such suffering under occupation and oppression, the sort of reality that Rome created, a God that's too pure, that's too distant or superior to join you in your suffering is a God that's really of no use at all. Right? Jesus, certainly that wasn't the case for him. There's this moment in Matthew's gospel when Jesus is asked, like, out of all the laws, which is the most important to keep? And maybe you're familiar with his response, but he says, love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. What he didn't say was, you have to become a divine super being like me, which is good news. It's really good news. You see, I can't see myself walking on water, but how different would my life be if there was a way for me to somehow let go of whatever anger or bitterness often tends to rest just below the surface of my life. I'll probably never turn water into wine, but maybe I could mature into the sort of person that could really begin loving and forgiving my enemies. I may not be able to calm stormy seas, but how different would my life be and how different would my impact be if I could somehow begin to live as well on the inside where the cup is dirty, right? As Jesus put it. If I could begin to live as well on the inside as I give the perception of living as well on the outside. I may not be able to heal the blind or the lame, but I know that a life that is free of greed and my life free from the lust for power is a more authentic me and a greater gift to this world. I'm convinced I will never raise the dead. But man, if I could figure out how to let the small self in me die so that a larger self, a more authentic self could be born and could truly live, then what sort of impact, what sort of implications would that have on me as not just a person, but the way that I interact with my family and the world around me? In my organized religious past, Christianity was about Jesus as God. That was almost the myopic focus. But in my disorganized religious present, it's about Jesus as human. And really, better stated, it's more about me becoming more and more human the way that I see Jesus being human. In my disorganized religious state, Christianity is also about Christ as the source of life. This is a definition of humanism. The definition of humanism is an outlook or system of thought attaching prime importance to human rather than divine or supernatural matters. Humanist beliefs stress the potential value and goodness of human beings, emphasize common human needs, and seek solely rational ways of solving human problems. I think if we were all in a room together having this conversation over coffee, we could probably agree on at least one thing, and that's that there's a human component that's involved with not only creating the problems, our greatest problems in the world, but also solving them. But I also think that in order to actually reach the potential that's necessary to solve the world's biggest problems, humanity, you and I would have to become something completely different. There would have to be an energy or a source or some sort of consciousness to pull us forward out of who we are now so that we, in the future, or maybe even today, become the types of people that could create a different now and a different tomorrow. And what's interesting is that I think when you read through the whole of the biblical narrative, there's this sense that for thousands of years, like humanity and Christianity itself, or Christians have sensed this as well. They've sensed this spirit, sort of this divine hum within the universe that's been involved in creating the contours of humanity and complexity. In fact, you see this in the opening words of our Christian Bible, or actually the Jewish Bible, if you want to be more specific, where the writers of Genesis write, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And now the earth was formless, it was empty, darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters." This is incredible. Like for thousands of years, 3, 4, 5,000 of years, there was this desert nomadic tribe of Hebrews that insisted that there was something. There was something, an energy, a hovering of life. At one point, they decided to start calling it Yahweh. And I mentioned this a couple of weekends ago, but Yahweh is sort of the sound that is made when you breathe in and out. It means breath. And actually, every time in the Old Testament, when you see the word Lord, as you're reading through the Old Testament, what you're really reading is a translated version of Yahweh. All throughout the Old Testament, woven into the stories, Yahweh, Lord, breath, Spirit. It's as though the whole of the Jewish narrative, at the core of it, sets this reminder that there is a source. There is a Spirit that infuses in us all some sense of life and vitality. And then you see this evolving and continuing on within the Christian scriptures and story itself. In the aftermath of Jesus' death and resurrection, the way early Christians began speaking of this Spirit is to call it Christ or the Christ. Or in more mythical ways of understanding Jesus, the term Christ consciousness or the cosmic Christ in some circles. And Paul, trying to make sense of this, writes, "I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. You," he writes, however, to a group of Romans, "you, however, are not in the realm of the flesh, but you are in the realm of the Spirit, if indeed the Spirit of God or the Spirit of Christ lives in you." To a group of Colossians, he writes, "For in him, the Christ, all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. He, Christ, is before all things, and in him all things hold together." And Paul, speaking to a group of philosophers in Athens about the reality of God, says, "For in him we live and move and have our being." And I know these are like sound bites that I'm pulling out of this, ancient text that's been pieced together over a couple, 1,500 years and 3 continents and multiple. I get that, but what I've noticed is that as someone migrates away from their organized religious perspective, these serve as these like subtle interruptions within the stories of the Bible and within a particular way that a certain type of or a certain worldview was held by a certain group of people. These serve as though they're breadcrumbs leading us inward, pointing to something bigger, fueling us in the deepest place of ourself, fueling us to become the sort of people God created us to be that could actually solve the problems of this world. And maybe some of you call it energy or spirit. Some of you might refer to it as ground of being or divine awareness. But in my tradition, the Christianity that I'm endeared to, it was called the Christ. In disorganized religion, Christianity is about Christ as the source of life. And then this, when you recognize how much humanity you've gained, and then you realize how much more there is to develop in you, when you realize you are powered by a source that's beyond human logic or construct or language, what my experience has been is that you begin to engage the Scripture with a more empowered and maybe with more permission, a more empowered lens, a more permissive lens. And so when Jesus says, "To whom much is given, much is expected. Whatever you've done for the least of these, so have you done for me. Go now and leave your life of sin. Sell all your possessions and give what's left over to the poor. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. And very truly I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing, and they will do even greater things to me." When you read what Jesus is saying to his disciples, what possibly starts to happen is you notice that Jesus is inviting and empowering his disciples to create a future that's even beyond himself. And Jesus seems to be okay with letting go of his power. He doesn't seem to be trying to reel it in. In fact, he's believing, he's letting these men and these women actually go because he believes that what they can do, they can actually do. He believes in the future that he envisions, that they'll actually be able to create this. And when you start to give energy to that idea, what, at least for me, began to happen was to believe that maybe I could do this as well. That maybe Jesus believes in me the way that he believed in those first century friends and communities. And for me, Christianity, what also started to happen was that this type of Christianity that converts people to a belief system to help them escape this world when they die started to die. But what was born in that was a Christianity that was about creating life, about creating healing in the world today. It became about creating a world where the hungry are actually fed, and the same groups of people don't keep going hungry. Or the people who are sick or wounded are cared for. Or the same groups of people who keep getting sick or wounded don't keep getting sick or wounded. Or where the marginalized or the people who are without a voice begin experiencing equality, and where they actually have a seat at the table. A world where the power of love starts to win out over the love of power, where real people lay down real weapons to work out real differences so that peace instead of war and violence mark the landscapes of this world. A future where people wake up to just how deeply they're loved by God, how valued they are by God. And the reason they're having that experience is because there's this peculiar tribe or peculiar tribes that are insisting that it's actually true and reinforcing that with the way that they treat each others and themselves in this world. And if I'd be lying if I told you that this was simple, okay? Because it's not. Or that we have it all figured out, because we don't. It's really hard to live the way that I think I understand about what I just said. Okay? It's hard. It's hard to be human. And Jesus at one point said, narrow is the way. Like this is a narrow road, and not everyone is going to choose it. And I wonder sometimes if a new kind of Christianity is one that's rooted in choices, even more so than the Christianity that we experienced in the past. It's hard to make different decisions when you're so addicted to your ego, when you're so addicted to comfort. You have to be right. Like it feels better to be right than to be alive sometimes. In some ways, a new kind of Christianity is about hearing and listening and trusting that there's a you that is fueled by something greater than your own human will. That in Christ, the ground of being, the universe, I'll let you use whatever terms you want to name that. It's hard to trust that you're more than the thoughts in your head or the material self that you see in the mirror. It's also hard to give yourself to creating a different world, a different future. There's sacrifice and heartache and loss and failure and struggle and insecurity. Doesn't that sound like fun, signing up for that, right? Like, let's all jump in on the bandwagon. No, it's hard. But I've been doing this 52 years, and it's been anything but perfection, all right? And it's been hard, but it's worth it. And it's how being Christian, I think, can look as you migrate from the past to the present. Jesus as human, or really Jesus as a way of me becoming human. Christ as the source. And Christianity is about the business of creating life and healing in the world today. By the way, if you have found this explanation this morning, or any explanation over the course of the last several weeks, woefully lacking, then guess what? Me too. Like, me too. Like, we're talking about trying to make sense of something that, like, a lot more, in some ways, more experienced people, but certainly a host of people for thousands of years have been trying to make sense of. When you're trying to give language that's something that died but now is living again in a new way, it's sometimes the best you can hope for are some new first words. And then I would say this too. I got, I guess it was last November, December, my back really started giving me fits. You know, too many playground basketball games, too many miles on asphalt, and I had this disc that started to really be irritated. I just couldn't get rid of it, and I tried to use like modalities that didn't include needles and like injections, but I just had to do it. I didn't have any other way to turn towards a new future for myself, and so I went to a doctor and I said, okay, I need an injection. He goes, well, actually, it's a series of injections. It's not one. It's like 2 or 3, depending on how you respond. And I said, okay, but, I'll get that done, and then I'm good to go, right? And he goes, no, actually, it's only a matter of time before you get sideways again, like you tweak it, or there's, you lift something you shouldn't, or do something you shouldn't. And so you're going to have to be back here for another injection. It might be 6 months or 2 years or whatever. And so if you're showing up here and it's the expectation is somehow we're going to settle it for you, like either your expectations need to be managed, or we have miscommunicated, or maybe you've just been completely asleep for the past 5 years. That's not what this is about, but what this could be about is just an injection. Like, is this enough for you to keep going? In whatever language you've heard me use, like, feel free to borrow that if it's helpful. Borrow what you need, steal what you must, but please don't canonize. Don't put this into doctrine, because this really is just another first word, and the journey continues. And what this does mean, though, is that you can't sit back and expect me or us to solve it for you. You have to engage. You have to pull your seat up to the table of community here. Own your seat well, but then allow God to start uncovering, unearthing whatever it is that you've been a part of. And I'm absolutely convinced that the best is yet to be said, and that God is still speaking. And will you be open? Will you be attentive enough to hear? Which brings me to the last thing that I think is worth mentioning. We get to do this in community. right? Like, if you close yourself off and isolate, the best you can hope for is a stunted type of spirituality. You won't grow. We need each other. We need people who don't think like us, who don't act like us, who don't come from the same environments or cultures, who see the world in a completely different way, who vote differently. Like, we need all of it, and it's messy and it's hard. But what that does is that it allows you to no longer be trapped into some sort of blind immaturity that you've created for yourself, or that you've drank like a bad dose of Kool-Aid. And will you pull a seat up to the table here and engage in community and allow something new to be formed? And then finally this, I don't know where this quote came from, but I heard this a couple of weeks ago. The best form of religion is religion that comforts those who are afflicted and afflicts those who are comfortable. And can I just, I know for some of you, you showed up here today limping. Like, it didn't go well this past week in your personal life or your professional life. Maybe you lost someone recently. Maybe the divorce is in the process of being finalized, or it just happened. Maybe there's some sort of failure that you're dealing with, or an addiction that continues to rule your life. And so the hope would be that whatever religion we, quote, embrace here in this community, that for those of us who are afflicted, there's comfort. And for the record, we all show up here a little conflicted and afflicted, right? But then also, we show up here really comfortable. Like, we don't want to move away from what already feels safe and familiar. But we should be afflicted in this. If it's not disrupting us and moving us towards a greater place of being human and whole and being a way of being solutions to the problems of this world, then whatever religion we're practicing is woefully inadequate. So brothers and sisters, friends and family, may we be comforted in our affliction. Maybe we sense the healing notion of God's grace and compassion and willingness to enter into our deepest place of suffering. And then also, may we be afflicted together. May we lick each other's wounds, may we lock arms, and may this community mark difference making in this world. Amen? Oh, that was convincing. God, this morning, thank you for whatever first words we feel permission to give to this journey that is ancient and beautiful and complex. It rises out of the ashes of things that have died, and it creates new life. And may what we do here together matter not just to us, but to a world that's in need of some really good news. Amen.